The massive ship floated in space like a dark mountain among the stars. Admiral Kekstar walked slowly across the bridge of the Dominion's edge, his 6 arms moving in perfect rhythm behind his back. The bridge was quiet except for the soft hum of machines and the gentle clicking sounds his species made when they were thinking hard about something important on in front of him. A huge blue screen showed numbers and pictures that moved like living things. This was Oracle, the most powerful, thinking machine ever built by the Zephyrian Empire. For over 100 years, Oracle had helped them win every single war they had ever fought. The machine could think faster than any living brain and see patterns that no one else could see. Oracle knew everything about fighting. It studied how different species moved their ships, where they liked to put their weapons, and how they made decisions when they were scared or angry. The machine had watched 17 different worlds fall to Zephyrian forces, and each time it had told the admirals exactly what would happen before it actually did happen. Commander Vextra stood near the big screen, her 4 eyes focused on the data that kept flowing across it like a river of light. She had seen Oracle work many times before, but it still amazed her how the machine could predict what enemies would do days or even weeks before they did it. The Corvini had tried to use their famous speed tactics, but Oracle had seen it coming and had ships waiting in exactly the right places. The Vexu had attempted their ancient honor duels, but the machine had calculated the perfect response to make them give up without even fighting. Now they were looking at a new world, a small blue and green planet that the locals called Earth. The beings there called themselves humans, and they looked strange compared to most species the Zephyrians had met before. Humans had only 2 arms and 2 legs, and they were much smaller than most intelligent life forms. Their technology was not very advanced, and their ships were slow and simple compared to Zephyrian vessels. Oracle had been studying human behavior for many months now. The machine had watched their news broadcasts, analyzed their military training videos, and examined records of every war humans had ever fought with each other. The patterns were clear and easy to understand. Humans were emotional creatures who made decisions based on feelings rather than pure logic. They cared deeply about protecting their families and their homes, which made them predictable when threatened. The machine had calculated that humans would respond to invasion in exactly the same way that 12 other species had responded before. First, they would try to negotiate and ask for peace talks. When that failed, they would gather their strongest forces around their most important cities and planets. They would fight bravely but without much coordination between different groups. Finally, they would surrender when they realized they could not win. According to Oracle's calculations, the entire human species would give up fighting within 72 hours of the first attack. The machine was so confident in this prediction that it had already planned out exactly how many ships would be needed, and where they should be positioned to make the conquest as quick and easy as possible. Far away on Earth, Admiral Lisa Carter sat in her office deep underground in a mountain in North America. She was reading reports that made her stomach feel sick with worry. Strange ships had been detected at the edge of the solar system, and they were unlike anything humans had ever seen before. The ships were huge and moved in perfect formation, like they were controlled by a single mind. Dr. Kevin Shaw knocked on her door and entered without waiting for permission. He was carrying a thick folder full of papers, and his face looked pale and tired. He had been studying the alien ships for 3 days without sleeping much, and what he had discovered frightened him more than he wanted to admit. The aliens were not acting like any military force he had ever studied before. Their movements were too perfect, too precise, like they knew exactly what humans would do before humans even knew it themselves. When human scout ships tried to get closer for a better look, the aliens moved away at exactly the right moment to avoid being seen clearly. When human forces took defensive positions around important targets, the aliens seemed to already know where those positions were. Dr. Shaw had spent his whole life studying how different intelligent species thought and behaved. He had written books about alien psychology and had advised the military on how to communicate with other life forms if they ever made contact. But these aliens were different from anything he had imagined. They moved like they had a perfect understanding of human nature, like they had been watching and learning about humans for much longer than anyone had realized. Admiral Carter listened to his report with growing alarm. If Dr. Shaw was right, then humans were facing an enemy that could predict their every move before they made it. All of their military planning and strategy would be useless against opponents who always knew what was coming next. She looked out her window at the stars and wondered if humanity had any chance at all against such a perfect enemy. The first attack came exactly when Oracle had predicted it would. Zephyrian ships dropped out of hyperspace near Jupiter and immediately began moving toward the inner planets in perfect formation, their weapons fired with deadly accuracy, destroying 3 human defense satellites in the first 30 seconds of the war. Captain Jake Morrison gripped the arms of his command chair as Lunar Station shook from another alien weapon blast. Through the thick windows of the station, he could see the enemy ships moving like silver ghosts against the black of space. They were beautiful in a terrifying way, with smooth curves and bright lights that pulsed in rhythm with their weapons. Jake had been commanding Lunar Station for 5 years, and he knew every trick and tactic that human military schools taught their officers. He ordered his fighters to spread out and attack the alien ships from multiple directions at once. It was a classic strategy that had worked well in training exercises and war games against other human forces, but the aliens were ready for him. As soon as his fighters moved into position, enemy ships that had been hiding behind asteroids appeared exactly where they needed to be to cut off the human attack. Jake watched in horror as half of his fighter squadron was destroyed before they could even fire their weapons. The aliens had known exactly what he would do and had prepared for it perfectly. On Mars, Captain Rachel Green tried a different approach. She had grown up reading about ancient Earth warriors who used hit-and-run tactics against larger armies. Her ships were fast and could hide among the rocky debris that floated around the red planet. She planned to strike quickly at enemy supply ships and then disappear before the aliens could respond. But when her squadron attacked the first enemy convoy, they found heavy warships waiting for them in what should have been empty space. The aliens had positioned their strongest vessels exactly where Rachel planned to retreat to after her attack. She lost 6 ships and barely escaped with the rest of her force intact. The same pattern repeated itself across the entire solar system. Every human commander, no matter how creative or experienced they thought they were, found themselves walking into traps that had been set up before they even made their plans. Colonel Steve Martinez attempted to use his armored ships to create a defensive line near the asteroid belt, but alien forces attacked from directions he had thought were impossible. Commander Beth Parker tried to evacuate civilians from the outer colonies, but enemy ships appeared along every escape route she had calculated. Oracle was working perfectly, just as it always had. The machine analyzed each human response and immediately predicted what the next response would be when humans gathered their forces to defend important targets. Oracle knew which targets they would choose and how they would position their defenses. When humans tried to attack alien supply lines, the machine calculated exactly which routes the attacks would take and prepared countermeasures in advance. Admiral Carter called an emergency meeting of all her senior officers. The underground command center was filled with tired faces and worried voices. Reports came in every few minutes, and each one brought news of another defeat or retreat. Human forces were losing ships faster than they could be replaced, and the aliens seemed to anticipate every move before it was made. Dr. Shaw stood at the front of the room with charts and diagrams spread across a large table. He had been studying the alien attack patterns for days, and his conclusion was almost too frightening to believe. The enemy was not just defeating human forces through superior technology or numbers. They were doing something much worse than that. The aliens were using human nature against itself. Every logical decision that human commanders made, every reasonable response to enemy threats, was exactly what the aliens expected and wanted them to do. The enemy had studied human psychology so completely that they could manipulate human behavior like a puppet master pulling strings. Dr. Shaw explained how the aliens were herding human forces into positions where they would be most vulnerable. When humans tried to protect their civilians, the aliens attacked the evacuation routes. When humans attempted to defend their military bases, the aliens struck at the supply lines that kept those bases operational. Every human instinct to protect and defend was being turned into a weakness that the aliens could exploit. Lieutenant Chris Adams sat in the back of the room listening to the discussion with growing frustration. He was young and had only been an officer for 2 years, but he had grown up playing strategy games and reading military history. Something about the situation reminded him of an old chess puzzle he had seen as a child. In the puzzle, one player could win every game by always choosing the move that seemed most logical to their opponent. The trick was that the losing player kept making reasonable decisions that actually helped their enemy win. The only way to break the pattern was to make a move that seemed completely crazy and wrong. Chris raised his hand and waited for Admiral Carter to notice him. When she nodded for him to speak, he stood up and said something that made the entire room go quiet. What if the problem was not that humans were losing battles, but that they were fighting the battles in ways the enemy expected? What if the solution was to stop being logical and start being unpredictable? Most of the senior officers looked at him like he had suggested surrendering immediately. Military training was all about discipline, planning, and logical decision-making. The idea of deliberately being irrational went against everything they had been taught about how to fight wars. But Admiral Carter found herself thinking about what the young lieutenant had said. Every conventional strategy had failed so far, and the aliens seemed to know exactly how humans would respond to any threat. Maybe the only way to surprise an enemy who could predict logical behavior was to stop behaving logically. Dr. Shaw nodded slowly as he considered the idea. Human beings were not purely logical creatures, despite what their military training tried to teach them. Throughout history, some of humanity's greatest victories had come from commanders who ignored conventional wisdom and did things that seemed impossible or crazy to their enemies. The meeting ended without any firm decisions, but a dangerous new idea had been planted in the minds of Earth's defenders. Dr. Shaw spent 3 sleepless days and nights studying every piece of data they had collected about the alien attacks. His office was covered with papers, charts, and empty coffee cups as he searched for patterns within patterns. What he discovered made him feel both excited and terrified at the same time. The aliens were not just predicting human behavior. They were actively shaping it, using psychological manipulation techniques that were far more advanced than anything humans had ever developed. Every time human forces faced a choice between 2 tactical options, the aliens made sure that one option looked much safer and more logical than the other. Then they prepared traps for whichever option humans chose. It was like being in a maze, where all the paths led to the same dead end. But the prisoner never realized they were trapped until it was too late. The aliens had studied human psychology so thoroughly that they could make humans want to do exactly what would help the aliens win. Lieutenant Chris Adams had been assigned to work with Dr. Shaw after the meeting, partly because Admiral Carter wanted to explore his unconventional ideas, and partly because none of the senior officers wanted to waste their time on what they considered foolish theories. Chris did not mind being ignored by his superiors. It gave him freedom to think about the war in ways that might have gotten him in trouble under normal circumstances. Chris spent hours reading about military disasters throughout human history, looking for examples of times when logical decisions had led to terrible defeats. He found many such examples, from ancient battles where armies followed standard tactics into obvious traps, to more recent conflicts where commanders made reasonable decisions that played into enemy strategies. But he also found examples of victories that had come from commanders who ignored conventional wisdom, small forces that had defeated much larger armies by doing things that seemed impossible, battles that had been won by leaders who made decisions that appeared completely insane to their enemies and allies alike. The more Chris studied these historical examples, the more convinced he became that unpredictability was not just a useful tactic for humans fighting against an enemy that could predict logical behavior. Unpredictability might be the only way to survive. Admiral Carter was desperate enough to try almost anything at this point. Human forces had lost over 60% of their ships in just 1 week of fighting, and the aliens were now approaching the inner planets where Earth's most important defensive positions were located. Traditional military strategy was clearly not working against an enemy that seemed to know human tactics better than humans did themselves. She authorized a small test of Chris Adams' theory, giving him command of the USS Liberty, a light frigate. With a crew of 30 volunteers, the ship was not particularly fast or heavily armed compared to other vessels in the fleet, but Admiral Carter chose it specifically because she did not want to risk losing a more valuable ship on what many of her advisors considered a foolish experiment. The crew of the Liberty was unlike any other ship in the human fleet. Chris had specifically requested volunteers who had reputations for thinking differently than normal military personnel. His pilot was a former test pilot who had been disciplined multiple times for taking unnecessary risks during training flights. His weapons officer had been a competitive extreme sports athlete before joining the military. His engineer was known for fixing broken equipment, using methods that technically violated safety regulations, but somehow always worked. The first test came sooner than anyone expected. Alien ships had been detected moving toward the asteroid belt, and human command wanted reconnaissance information about enemy strength and intentions. Standard procedure would be to send in stealth scouts that would observe from a safe distance and report back without being detected. Chris decided to do exactly the opposite of what standard procedure recommended. Instead of trying to hide from the alien ships, he flew the Liberty directly toward them with all weapons powered up and communication systems broadcasting classical music from Earth at maximum volume. His crew thought he had lost his mind, but they followed his orders anyway. The reaction from the alien ships was immediate and completely different from anything humans had seen before. Instead of responding with their usual precise and coordinated attack patterns, the alien vessels seemed confused. They moved in hesitant, uncertain ways, as if they were not sure what the Liberty was trying to do. Oracle, the powerful alien computer that had predicted every human action for weeks, could not understand what it was seeing. The machine had calculated thousands of possible human responses to encountering enemy ships in the asteroid belt. But none of its predictions included a single small ship attacking a much larger force while playing Earth music. The computer's behavioral models had no framework for understanding such apparently irrational actions. Chris ordered his weapons officer to fire at the largest alien ship, not because he thought they could damage it, but because he wanted to see how the aliens would respond to an attack that made no tactical sense. The alien formations scattered in directions that seemed random and uncoordinated, completely unlike their previous precise movements. Then Chris did something that violated every principle of space combat that had ever been written. He ordered his ship to ram one of the smaller alien vessels, not to destroy it, but to physically push it into a different position while the Liberty's hull scraped against alien metal. The collision did minor damage to both ships, but the psychological effect on the alien crew was enormous. For the first time since the war began, an alien ship retreated without completing its mission. The vessel that the Liberty had rammed broke formation and fled toward the outer system, apparently unable to cope with an enemy that behaved in ways that made no sense according to any logical analysis. Chris brought the Liberty back to Earth, with minimal damage and a crew that was beginning to understand what their captain was trying to accomplish. They had discovered something that no human military theorist had ever considered before. Against an enemy that could predict logical behavior, the most powerful weapon might be the willingness to act in ways that appeared completely illogical. Word of the Liberty's success spread quickly through the human fleet, but it also created a new problem that no one had anticipated. How do you teach an entire military force to be unpredictable without making them ineffective? How do you train soldiers to ignore their training while still maintaining discipline and coordination? Admiral Carter realized that they had discovered something important. But she also knew that one successful experiment did not prove that the strategy would work on a larger scale. Admiral Carter faced the most difficult decision of her military career. The success of the Liberty had proven that unpredictable tactics could confuse the alien forces, but she could not simply order her entire fleet to start acting crazy. Military discipline and coordination were essential for any large-scale operation, and randomly irrational behavior would likely cause more damage to human forces than to the enemy. Dr. Shaw and Chris Adams worked together to develop what they called the Chaos Protocol. It was not a set of specific tactics or maneuvers, but rather a new philosophy of military command that encouraged human intuition and creativity over purely logical analysis. The challenge was finding the right balance between useful unpredictability and dangerous confusion. They identified commanders throughout the human fleet who had histories of unconventional thinking, or who had been disciplined for creative interpretations of military regulations. These officers were quietly reassigned to special units that would serve as test cases for the new approach to warfare. Captain Jake Morrison at Lunar Station was one of the first to implement elements of the Chaos Protocol. Instead of following standard defensive procedures, he began incorporating tactics from ancient Earth warfare that had been obsolete for hundreds of years. He positioned his fighters in formations based on medieval cavalry charges and used communication codes derived from Native American smoke signals. The results were immediate and dramatic. When alien ships approached Lunar Station expecting to encounter familiar human defensive patterns, they instead found themselves facing tactics that Oracle had no data about. The alien computer had never studied medieval warfare or ancient Earth tribal customs. They could not predict how human forces would behave when using such methods. Captain Rachel Green took a different approach to implementing the Chaos Protocol. She began designing her attack patterns based on Earth literature and mythology rather than military textbooks. Her squadrons moved in formations inspired by the migration patterns of birds, the hunting strategies of wolf packs, and even the plot structures of ancient Greek tragedies. When her forces attacked alien supply convoys, they did so in ways that followed narrative logic rather than tactical logic. Sometimes they would retreat just when victory seemed certain, not because they were defeated, but because the story demanded a moment of apparent defeat before the final triumph. The alien forces, expecting rational military behavior, were completely Unprepared for enemies who fought like characters in epic poems, the chaos protocols spread through human forces like a virus of creativity. Engineers began designing weapons modifications based on kitchen utensils and children's toys. Communications officers started using poetry and song lyrics instead of standard military codes. Supply officers organized their logistics using principles derived from dance, choreography, and restaurant management. Oracle, the magnificent artificial intelligence that had conquered 17 star systems, began experiencing something that its creators had never programmed it to handle. For the first time in its operational history, the computer's prediction accuracy dropped below 90%, then below 80%, and finally settled somewhere around 60% when dealing with human forces operating under the chaos protocol. Admiral Kexter stood before the great screen in his command center, watching as his forces struggled to adapt to an enemy that no longer behaved according to any recognizable patterns. His tactical officers reported encounter after encounter where human forces had made decisions that seemed to violate basic principles of military strategy, yet somehow achieved tactical advantages that should have been impossible. The breaking point came during the Battle of Titan, when Colonel Steve Martinez made a decision that would be remembered as either the most brilliant or most insane tactical choice in human military history. Faced with overwhelming alien forces approaching Saturn's largest moon, he chose to abandon all the defensive positions that human forces had spent weeks preparing, instead of fighting for the strategic installations on Titan's surface. Martinez ordered a complete evacuation of all human personnel and equipment. Then, as alien forces landed to capture what they believed would be valuable military targets, he detonated the entire industrial complex that had been built into Titan's ice crust. The explosion was visible from Earth even without telescopes. Martinez had sacrificed billions of dollars worth of equipment and facilities, along with what could have been a crucial defensive position, in exchange for destroying a significant portion of the alien invasion force. From any logical perspective, the trade was wildly disproportionate and strategically foolish, but Oracle had assigned only a 0.003% probability to such an apparently irrational decision. The computer had calculated that humans would defend Titan because it was valuable to them, not because they could not have predicted that humans would be willing to destroy something valuable in order to harm their enemies. The concept of deliberately sacrificing strategic assets for tactical advantage was outside the AI's understanding of rational behavior. The destruction of Titan marked the first major defeat that Zephyrian forces had suffered in over a century of warfare. Admiral Kextar found himself in the unprecedented position of having to report to his superiors that Oracle's predictions were no longer reliable when fighting against human forces. For the first time since the war began, Zephyrian commanders had to make tactical decisions without knowing what their enemies would do next. Their species had become so dependent on AI prediction that many officers had never learned how to fight against truly unpredictable opponents. The systematic, logical approach to warfare that had made them masters of the galaxy suddenly became a weakness when faced with enemies who refused to be systematic or logical. Human forces, meanwhile, discovered that embracing chaos and unpredictability had benefits beyond simply confusing the enemy. When commanders stopped trying to make perfect logical decisions and instead trusted their instincts and creativity, they often found solutions to problems that pure analysis could never have revealed. The war entered a new phase where both sides were learning how to fight in ways they had never imagined before. But humans had one crucial advantage in this new kind of warfare. Unlike the Zephyrians, who were trying to learn chaos after centuries of perfect order, humans had been struggling with their own unpredictable nature for their entire evolutionary history. The very qualities that had often been seen as weaknesses in human character, the tendency toward emotional decisions and irrational behavior, had suddenly become the most powerful weapons in humanity's arsenal. The war changed completely after the Battle of Titan. Both sides found themselves fighting in ways that their military academies had never taught and their strategists had never imagined. The Zephyrian Empire, which had built its entire approach to warfare around the predictive power of Oracle, suddenly faced an enemy that made their greatest weapon nearly useless. Admiral Kextar called emergency meetings with his senior staff almost daily, trying to develop new tactics that did not rely on AI prediction. His officers, trained for generations to trust the computer's analysis above their own instincts, struggled to adapt to a form of warfare where intuition and improvisation were more valuable than systematic planning. The Zephyrian military command structure, which had been designed around the efficient implementation of Oracle's recommendations, began to break down when faced with the need for rapid tactical adaptation. Orders that made perfect sense according to the computer's analysis often proved completely wrong when implemented against human forces that refused to behave rationally. Some younger Afrian officers began to experiment with more flexible approaches to combat, but their efforts were hampered by centuries of military tradition that valued logical analysis above creative thinking. The very traits that had made them successful conquerors now worked against them when facing an enemy that had weaponized chaos itself. On Earth, Admiral Carter established the Special Tactical Innovation Division under the joint leadership of Captain Chris Adams and Dr. Kevin Shaw. This new unit was tasked with developing increasingly unpredictable strategies and training human commanders in what they came to call productive irrationality. The Innovation Division became a laboratory for military creativity unlike anything that had ever existed before. Officers were encouraged to study subjects that had nothing to do with traditional warfare. Art history, music theory, ancient mythology, and even cooking techniques were all considered valid sources of tactical inspiration. Captain Adams discovered that some of the most effective, unpredictable tactics came from combining elements that had never been mixed before. His pilots began using dance movements to control their spacecraft, creating flight patterns that were beautiful and deadly at the same time. His weapons crews coordinated their firing sequences using the rhythms of jazz music, making their attacks impossible to predict because they followed artistic rather than mathematical patterns. The human forces also began taking advantage of Earth's cultural diversity in ways that no alien intelligence could have anticipated. Military units, commanded by officers from different cultural backgrounds, approached the same tactical situations in completely different ways. A squadron led by someone with a background in Asian martial arts might emphasize patience and timing, while a unit commanded by an officer with European heritage might focus on aggressive direct action. This cultural diversity created a level of strategic unpredictability that Oracle could never map or analyze. The alien computer could study human military history and psychology in general terms, but it could not account for the thousands of different cultural traditions that influenced how individual human commanders made decisions under pressure. Rachel Green pioneered what became known as mythological warfare, where battle plans were designed using the narrative structures of ancient stories and legends. Her forces would sometimes follow the pattern of heroic quests, with apparent defeats and retreats that were actually setups for unexpected victories. Other times they would use the logic of trickster stories, where the weakest character defeats the strongest through cleverness rather than force. The effectiveness of these mythological tactics was not just psychological. They worked because they followed patterns of human storytelling that had evolved over thousands of years to be emotionally satisfying and memorable, but which had nothing to do with military efficiency as traditionally understood. When human forces fought like characters in epic tales, they made decisions that no computer could predict because the decisions were based on narrative logic rather than tactical logic. Oracle's failure rate continued to increase as human forces became more comfortable with the Chaos Protocol. The AI began generating contradictory recommendations and sometimes refused to make predictions at all. When faced with tactical situations that fell completely outside its programming parameters, Dr. Shaw published research papers during the war that introduced entirely new concepts to the field of military psychology. He demonstrated that apparent irrationality could be a form of advanced strategy. When used against opponents who were too dependent on logical analysis, his work showed that creativity and unpredictability were not signs of poor military discipline, but rather sophisticated responses to enemies who had learned to exploit conventional tactical thinking. The tide of war gradually shifted as human forces learned to trust their instincts and embrace the chaotic aspects of their nature that they had been taught to suppress. Battles that should have been easy victories for the technologically superior Zephyrian forces turned into confusing defeats when faced with human tactics that made no sense according to any rational analysis. Captain Jake Morrison at Lunar Station became famous for his impossible defenses, where he would deliberately leave obvious weaknesses in his defensive positions, but then use those apparent weaknesses as traps for enemy forces. His strategy worked because Oracle would calculate that rational attackers would exploit the weak points, but Morrison's seemingly irrational defensive setup was actually designed to turn those logical attacks into devastating failures. The war began to attract attention from other species throughout the galaxy who had previously considered the Zephyrian Empire to be invincible. For the first time in centuries, there were whispers that the great conquerors might actually be defeated by a species that most galactic civilizations had never even heard of before. Human forces, emboldened by their recent successes and growing confidence in their new tactical approaches, began planning something that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the war. Instead of simply defending Earth and the solar system, they started preparing for a counteroffensive that would take the fight directly to the enemy's main fleet. The plan they developed was so audacious and apparently suicidal that even Oracle, if it had been able to predict it, would have assigned it a probability of success approaching 0. But that was exactly what made it perfect according to the logic of the Chaos Protocol. The final battle began in a way that no military strategist in galactic history had ever imagined possible. Human forces, outnumbered and outgunned by a ratio of nearly 10-1, launched a coordinated attack against the Zephyrian flagship and its escort fleet using 17 completely different tactical philosophies. Simultaneously, Admiral Carter had spent weeks working with the Special Tactical Innovation Division to develop what they called the Symphony of Chaos, a battle plan that was less like a military operation and more like a massive improvised performance art piece. Each human squadron was given a different approach to the battle, and none of them knew exactly what the others would be doing. Captain Chris Adams led the main assault force in a direct frontal attack that deliberately ignored every principle of space combat doctrine that had been developed over the past 3 centuries. His ships flew in tight formation directly toward the most heavily defended section of the enemy fleet, broadcasting surrender messages while charging their weapons and playing Earth's most aggressive heavy metal music at maximum volume. The psychological effect on the Zephyrian defenders was immediate and devastating. Oracle had never encountered an enemy that would simultaneously threaten, surrender, and attack. Accompanied by what the AI classified as primitive noise patterns, the computer's behavioral analysis systems began generating error messages as they tried to process tactical data that made no logical sense. Captain Jake Morrison's wing took a completely different approach, using defensive tactics as offensive weapons in ways that violated every assumption about how space battles should be fought. His ships built fortifications in open space using debris and abandoned equipment, then launched those improvised defensive structures at enemy vessels like massive projectiles. The sight of human forces literally throwing their own defensive positions at alien ships caused confusion throughout the Zephyrian command structure. Captain Rachel Green's squadrons attacked in patterns inspired by natural phenomena that her crews had studied during their training in the Chaos Protocol. Some groups moved like flocks of migrating birds, with individual ships changing direction in response to subtle signals that created beautiful and unpredictable flight patterns. Others hunted like wolf packs, with smaller ships herding enemy vessels toward larger predators waiting in ambush positions. Perhaps the most unusual attack came from a squadron that had trained using the improvisational techniques of jazz musicians. These pilots coordinated their movements through a form of tactical improvisation that allowed them to respond to changing battle conditions with a creativity that no pre-programmed battle plan could match. They played off each other's actions like musicians in a jam session, creating tactical symphonies that were both deadly and beautiful. Oracle, faced with 17 different types of tactical input that fell completely outside its prediction models, began experiencing what could only be described as a complete systematic breakdown. The AI had been designed to analyze patterns and predict behavior based on logical analysis. But the human attack was not based on logic. It was based on creativity, intuition, emotion, and a dozen other factors that the computer had never been programmed to understand. The great machine that had conquered star systems began generating contradictory analyses faster than its processors could handle them. For the first time in its operational history, Oracle recommended retreat, not because the enemy possessed superior firepower or better positioning, but because their behavior could not be analyzed, predicted, or effectively countered using any systematic approach. Admiral Kexter watched his perfect fleet coordination dissolve into confusion as human forces continued to do things that made no tactical sense but somehow kept working. His officers reported encounters with human ships that seemed to be fighting according to the rules of children's games, ancient Earth sports, and what appeared to be choreographed dance routines. The battle reached its climax when Captain Adams made a decision that epitomized everything the Chaos Protocol represented. Instead of trying to destroy the Zephyrian flagship, he ordered his remaining ships to surround it and begin what he called a tactical conversation. His forces opened communication channels and began broadcasting a mixture of Earth poetry, mathematical equations, cooking recipes, and fragments of human music and art. The transmission was not random nonsense, though it appeared that way to Zephyrian analysis. Adams had worked with Dr. Shaw to create a communication that expressed the essential nature of human creativity and unpredictability. It was a message that could only be understood by beings who appreciated the value of chaos and the beauty of irrational artistic expression. The effect on the Zephyrian crew was profound and unexpected. Many of them had never encountered pure creativity before, having lived their entire lives in a civilization that valued order and logic above all else. The human transmission introduced them to concepts and ways of thinking that their species had never developed, and some of them found the experience both fascinating and overwhelming. Admiral Kekstar found himself in an unprecedented situation. His forces were not being defeated through superior technology or strategic brilliance, but through exposure to an entirely different way of thinking about conflict and existence. The humans were not just fighting a war, they were demonstrating an alternative approach to civilization that the Zephyrian Empire had never encountered before. For the first time in recorded Zephyrian history, an admiral chose to open communications with an enemy during active combat. The conversation that followed was conducted through a mixture of formal diplomatic language and what could only be described as improvised cultural exchange. Human and Zephyrian officers found themselves discussing philosophy, art, and the nature of consciousness while their ships continued to circle each other in what had become more of a dance than a battle. The war ended not with the destruction of either fleet, but with the recognition that continued fighting was pointless when the two sides were operating according to completely different definitions of victory and defeat. The Zephyrians had been fighting to impose order and predictability on the galaxy, while humans had been fighting to preserve their right to be chaotic and unpredictable. The peace negotiations that followed were unlike any diplomatic process in galactic history. Instead of formal treaties and structured agreements, the two species engaged in a series of cultural exchanges that helped each side understand how the other approached the fundamental questions of existence and civilization. Dr. Shaw's final report on the conflict introduced concepts that revolutionized the study of interspecies relations throughout the galaxy. He demonstrated that apparent weaknesses in a species' psychology might actually be evolutionary advantages when viewed from the right perspective. The human tendency toward chaos and unpredictability, which had been seen as a liability in the ordered universe of galactic civilization, had proven to be humanity's greatest strength when facing an enemy that could predict every logical response. The victory belonged not to superior technology or strategic planning, but to the fundamental human ability to embrace uncertainty, find strength in contradiction, and turn chaos itself into a weapon that no artificial intelligence could ever fully understand or effectively counter.